Welcome to this lunch briefing, Afghanistan Elusive Negotiation Process from Peacebuilding back to Peacemaking. Today we have the great honor of having Mr. Ambassador Nasir Andisha together with Professor Alessandro Mansuti to discuss the ongoing negotiation process in Afghanistan. As you know, Afghanistan has been the theater of a series of conflicts that have lasted for more than 40 years. And following the attacks of September 11, 2001, a coalition led by the United States has intervened in Afghanistan. So after 20 years, American soldiers are expected to have withdrawn by this autumn. And the question that we ask ourselves is whether the current negotiation between the Afghan government and the Taliban will succeed in bringing peace and security in the country. So let me introduce our two speakers today. First, Mr. Ambassador Nasir Andisha, who was previously Afghanistan Deputy Foreign Minister between 2015 and 2019, and Ambassador of Afghanistan to Australia, New Zealand, and Fiji between 2011 and 2015. He has also served as the Director General of the Fifth Political Division and as the Director of Multilateral Economic Relations and International Financial Institutions. Ambassador Andisha has also worked at the Energy Charter Secretariat in Brussels and served at the Permanent Mission of Afghanistan at the United Nations headquarters in New York in 2008. Before joining the Foreign Service, he worked with the International Committee of the Red Cross as a field officer in northern Afghanistan. Dr. Andisha taught at the Institute of Diplomacy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and at the Beruni University in Afghanistan. He holds a master's degree from Texas A&M University and a PhD from the Asia Pacific College of Diplomacy at the Australian University, a national university, As for Professor Alessandro Mansuti, he is a professor of anthropology at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. He was formerly a research fellow at Yale University between 2008 and 2010, and at the Institut für die Wissenschaften von Menschen in Vienna in 2020. He was a grantee of the MacArthur Foundation between 2004 and 2006, and visiting professor at the University of Vienna in 2012, and again this year in 2021, and Arizona State University in 2014. He has conducted multi-sited research since the mid-90s in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran to study the modes of solidarity and cooperation mobilized in a situation of conflict and forced migration. He has subsequently broadened the geographical scope of his research to include Afghans living in Western countries. He is the author of War and Migration, Social Networks and Economic Strategies of the Hazaras of Afghanistan, which was published in 2005, and more recently, Homo Itinerans Towards a Global Ethnography of Afghanistan, which came up last year. And he's been also the co-editor of several edited volumes. So this session is recorded, and you are able to ask questions using the chat box on the right of your screen. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Mr. Ambassador Andisha for him to give his presentation, which will be followed by comments by Professor Mansuti. Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Belad. And I also wanted to thank the Graduate Institute and our good friend and colleague, Professor Mansuti, who is also a friend of Afghanistan. He has extensive understanding and research in Afghanistan, and he speaks also some Farsi Dari, which is an asset for him. So, خوش آمدید. But I also wanted to extend my greetings to all students, colleagues, the participants who are listening to today's talk about Afghanistan, peace process in Afghanistan. I wanted to focus today's talk basically from a practitioner's point of view, and I understand that in our audience we have a number of students and a number of especially master's level students. So I would leave you to find out the theories peacemaking, peace building, you know, from sociology to anthropology to political science to fit today's discussion. So I'm not going to elaborate on those, but come and discuss it from a practitioner's point of view. And of course, we have Professor there also with us that he could maybe cover a few. And I have also, at the same time, as Professor Belad said, I have also an academic hat and also a hat of a concerned citizen of Afghanistan, which using this could allow me to be more argumentative rather than diplomatic in today's discussion. So with this, I will begin with sort of setting the scene for those of us who probably does not have enough understanding of Afghanistan, Afghanistan's geopolitics, Afghanistan's demography, history, and all this. I'm not going to, of course, give you a lecture in history here, but just to basically warn you of the complexity of situation. I just intentionally put this map, which I find that it speaks a lot. It's a book basically. You can write a book about this map. If you look at geography, if you look at the history, if you look at the neighborhood and the ethnography and the whole composition of many actors and causes for today's discussion and for the conflict in Afghanistan. So if you look at this map and if you look at the little explanation of the map around and the countries around it, I can greatly give you a sense of what we are talking about. So the complexities, I understand that this word is used and overused. There is no simple situation. All the situations of peacemaking and peace building and conflict resolution are complex. But then if you look at this map, it can tell you that in case of Afghanistan, it's really a complex conflict, and it needs a very nuanced and a sort of a deep and comprehensive approach toward peacemaking. And that's why intentionally I use the term cycle of peace building and peacemaking, because in the case of Afghanistan, the peace building and peacemaking, and the peace building is not a linear process. And now it's very evident that it's circular, and at least there have been in the past 30 years 3 peace efforts, if you also count the cabinet. And then, of course, there are the toolbox of peacemaking and peace building. Again, I will let you go through this literature yourself. That it was, the multi-dimensional peace building, and then we, in the late 80s and the beginning of 90s, and then we have, this peace building as a state building, what they call the liberal peace or technocratic peace. And then the United Nations came up with this peace architecture, filling the gaps, Brahimi reports, and things like this. And then last but not least, and the most important, where my discussion will be focused on, is the sort of nationally owned peace building and peace processes. And then, of course, this is something that you could look at, Karen, today's discussion from this lens also. So coming back to Afghanistan and the division of actors and causes of a conflict. Of course, if you talk to anyone, for the ease of reference, they will give you 1978, the Soviet invasion of the country. They say that, of course, if you're a psychologist, if you're a sociologist, if you're a cultural anthropologist, you can go deeper and see the underlying causes of a conflict which exists in any society. Of course, a society which was, a post-colonial society, a state which was basically built by colonial powers, certainly not to serve its community, not to be, a sort of, a consortium or a coalition or a social contract of different communities coming together and serving each other and building an institution, but an state. This is one approach to it. And a state which was basically carved out of an area of a former Afghan empire to basically serve the interests of the 2 major powers of the time, which was the British India and Tsarist Russia. So I don't go down there, but I'm saying that you can go up to this level and to look at the causes of the conflict. But then everything suddenly, imploded or exploded in 1979, 1978 with the communist coup 78, and then 79 of the Soviet invasion, and then the state lost the monopoly of use of power, and everything since then is becoming more and more complex. And this complexity is, as I said, as deep rooted there. So if you're a development expert, you look at the institution aspect of it, the GDP of the country, the geography, the demography, things like that. But if you're looking at it from the perspective of geography, student geopolitics, and international relations, then you go into the regional context and see the Cold War context, but then post-Cold War, where you have these regional forces or regional security complexes around Afghanistan, Central Asia, Russia and China, and then you have Iran, Middle East, you have South Asia, India, and Pakistan. So there is enough ample studies for you to dive deep into it. So that's that kind of approach. So the reason I mentioned this is just to warn you that the discussion and discourse of peace building and peacemaking in Afghanistan needs this kind of a deeper dive into this, the causes of conflict and the actors which are involved. So now let me put this, the current situation into peacemaking into perspective. So where we stand right now. Where we stand right now is that there is a peace effort going on in Doha. And this peace effort in the history of, I'll just save you this 2001 up to now, because I'm sure this is very contemporary and you can certainly look at it, or maybe you're already aware of that within these interventions since 2001, beginning of 2009 and 2010, they call it the first phase of peace making efforts started. The United States, after the Obama administration came into power, started a parallel track for peace making and bringing, which had two elements: one, regional elements, talking to the countries in the region, and then of course there was an approach toward the armed oppositions toward Taliban at that time. So that peace efforts, only the regional part culminated into what we call it now the Istanbul Process, sort of a regional platform where because they thought that conflict is mostly regional and has to be taken care by region, was in a confidence building regional an institution called the Istanbul Process, Heart of Asia, and basically started by Turkey, but then also followed by the Arabs. But in terms of the local peace making, things didn't move the way it was supposed to, and there was bits and pieces of peace making in the periphery, but it didn't really result in something genuine. But now in 2018, with the Trump administration and the ideas of withdrawal of the American forces, so they kind of pushed this question of peace building, peacemaking in Afghanistan, with Ambassador Khalilzad being the special envoy, and pushing really all the parties to come around the table. And what he did, I mean, I'm not again going into the details of that he produced on 29th of February last year an agreement between the Taliban and the United States on the way forward on the peace process, which involves some of the causes of some of the steps for confidence building, basically as releasing. Of course, from the government of Afghanistan point of view, our concern was and still is that the government was not sufficiently consulted. It was up to very long time was not party to this, party to this negotiation. So ultimately, again, the United States and the NATO forces came into Kabul, and we also signed a parallel declaration with the government of Afghanistan. In any case, so a delegation from the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan was sent to sit across the table with the Taliban. So if you put it again in the context of all the literature of peace making. So you already jumped ahead of yourself, and just, you know, to have peace, because the idea of peacemaking and peace building in our minds, you know, especially internationally, if you have an image, it's the images that, you know, people, the two antagonists or the number of parties, they're sitting around the table. I think that was achieved in Doha. But then, of course, it's more than a year. It didn't result in that very basic element of peace making, let alone peace building, which is a ceasefire, which is a reduction of violence, and which could allow, you know, the peace process to move. And the reason, I mean, there are many reasons. I'm just again, you know, I'm trying to use you know, some of, again, the literature which exists in this, is that in peace making, from the beginning of it, you know, when you try to first of all, you're in the processes that you have to separate the belligerents and create a ceasefire or reduction of violence, which could allow discussions, and then try to make peace, which is now you're in the process, and of course then you move on to the peace building. So for the parties to come in, we have, you know, again in the literature, this idea of ripeness and readiness of the situation, and then the context of peace processes and peace agreement. In terms of the ripeness, and I mean, here the literature helps us, because you have to, you know, look at the situation and then put it into the perspective of, you know, all these lessons that we have learned. First, it says that the parties will come together if there is a perception of mutually hurting stalemate, meaning that the two sides, or the belligerents, if there are two sides or many sides, reach an understanding that there is a stalemate, and this stalemate is mutually hurting, and there is no military solution. Have we reached this situation? I don't think so, because Taliban still believe that with the withdrawal, because for them this negotiation is also part of the tactic to get the United States out, and if not the political groups which are there in Doha, but the others, there are many others who believe that a military solution is possible, which means that, you know, we are going towards a disastrous civil war. Number two, that there should be a clear desire among the belligerents to seek way out of the conflict peacefully. I mean, at the rhetoric level, there is, and we will accept this. Fine, at least, you know, rhetorically, we agree that, you know, there is a desire for this. And then there is this question of emergence of a consensus among the external stakeholders in that conflict situation, because as I said at the beginning, the conflict in Afghanistan has a domestic, as a local ingredients, which, you know, you can explore it. There are books, there are no many arguments in here that what are the local sources of conflict. I'm not going to dwell to that right now, maybe the question and answers. And then there's a regional one. We know, you know, the differences among our regions, you know, the sort of security dilemma around Afghanistan. And then there is the international context, and which nicely brings us to tomorrow's summit here in Geneva, which is, you know, between President Biden and President Putin. I mean, I'm sure Afghanistan is, and I heard it is, one of the agendas. So that is the sort of, you know, the international level of it. So emergence of consensus, maybe tomorrow could be part of this consensus building among the major powers about the peace in Afghanistan. So there, I believe, you know, as a diplomat, that there is an emerging consensus among the region. But have we reached, you know, a total consensus of how the peace should look like, and what will be the stakes of all the stakeholders, and how a future peace of Afghanistan could balance the interests of all players? And I think that's also our job as a state and as a nation, to balance that interest, but of course, you know, a region plays also. And then the fourth, and again, that's also very important, sometimes we forget about, that is the political and psychological motivation of the leading players in conflict and also in the peace process. So what are the motivations, and what are, you know, the psychological and basically understanding of personality of leaders who are leading these efforts in different. This also has, you know, an important. So then you leave this. So if the situation is ready, the situations, you know, sometimes it's becoming ready naturally, you know, after a war, after a civil war, after, you know, a stalemate. But sometimes this kind of situations of ripeness could be induced, could be midwifed, basically, that, okay, and this is the case that we have. It's basically United States, NATO, and some of the other actors and the players, or we are all trying to induce the situation of ripeness, that the situation is becoming ripe. Of course, there is room for diplomacy to create conducive situation, but you know, if when situation comes normally and naturally, I think we will have a quicker and a faster peace process rather than, you know, all these backs and the forth. But in any case, I think the situation is becoming conducive because there are two ways. One is apart from the others, I can just focus only in the current situation. One is that when there is a major intervention in a country, then there is an open moment for peacemaking, which it was in 2001. We used it, but there is a lot that we lost in that moment. So I will call it a lost opportunity because structurally we didn't really focus on building, you know, sustainable structure for peace in Afghanistan. Again, you know, we went to our old practices. Or again, when there is a major withdrawal of international intervention from a country. In a major intervention, the situation is much easier because you have a huge commitment internationally. But on a major withdrawal, you have to really work hard diplomatically and take chance. So again, I will say that there is a possibility, there is, you know, momentum. The situation is kind of induced, the ripeness is induced, but what can we do? There is a chance, and we have to jump, and we should not let this crisis to be wasted. So the last part is the part of substance of a peace process, the context of the peace process. I mean, the liberal peace a theory and the bureaucratic peace, which we were basically a basket case of it in 2001, 2002, which was led by the UN. They brought their own toolbox. The assumption was that in Afghanistan, it's the failure of institutions, an institution breakdown. Let's re-establish the institution rather than looking into the underlying causes of the conflict and thinking that the civil war in Afghanistan was not simply because of the, you know, the breakdown of institution. It was actually a breakdown of the society. So there was a need for a social contract, which I can tell you there will never existed a social contract in the way that the social contracts evolve in many countries. I mean, example, Switzerland is the case in point. So the bureaucratic approach was that, you know, let's build the institutions collapse, and the institutional building, so you bring all these experts, the UN bureaucrats, and they say, like, oh, institutions, constitution, and then you have to push the constitution to be done in 16 months, and then there is a timetable for an election, blah, and then you have assembly, everything will be, as you know, in Texas, they used to say it's hunky-dory, so it will be fine, so it's, you get an estate, but that was certainly, you know, a mistake, and of course there were voices even at that time, but those voices were silent. And at the same time, it's I think that was the mood of international peacemaking in early 2000. Who could stop the liberal peace, architecture at the time? So coming now to the context of the peace, which is now I think the major area of focus for all of us who are involved, directly or indirectly through research or directly through practice, or, you know, Maison de la Paix right in front of us, which will look is a platform also for peace building and peacemaking here, you know, in the capital of peace building around the world in Geneva, is that we leave those, you know, the ripeness of situation, kind of take it as given because it seems that, you know, it's coming at the end of a withdrawal. Of course, we have to look at the protection of civilians. We have to be concerned about, you know, prevention of all major atrocities which could happen at the end of withdrawals. And this is an agenda which we are, you know, pursuing with another part of Geneva. But we have to look at the context of peace building here and the underlying, looking into the underlying causes of the conflict. And that's why I think it's important to look into this peace process in Afghanistan much thoroughly, and it has to be, looked at in a more different way, which is the context of nationally owned, and I would call it socially owned also, a peace process, a genuine one. And I can give an example. An example is Nepal. Nepal's constitutional process took 8 years. Ours took 16 months. And Nepal is not more, diverse and heterogeneous society as Afghanistan, even religiously, and doesn't have a very, a complex geography, of course, a landlocked, but then there's China and India, and there are, two societies. And so in that country, but still, this peace building process keeps going on in that country. They have trials and the failures, trials and the mistakes, up to a situation now they can claim that the Nepal is their own peace. And again, the other case is Somalia. Of course, Somalia is not still, you have to know there's a lot to be looked at. But then the question of how the underlying sources of conflict in there, which is basically the division of power, and to kind of a consensus system for the major players, have so far has worked. Yes, it's not a very desirable situation, but to move to, first of all, to prevent conflict from recurring socially, I think that's the sort of an indirect democratic system which has so far has held. And then, of course, then there is an element of Al-Shabaab, which will be weaker if the society is cohesive in a place like Somalia. So, of course, we lost that opportunity, but then there is another opportunity in front of us, and we have to look at this opportunity deeply, thoroughly, and to have a much more what they call comprehensive lens toward the context of a peace agreement, and should not again waste this opportunity which is in front of us to build a sustainable and just peace in Afghanistan. And with this, I'll thank you very much. I don't know how long it took, but then there certainly be questions which I will be happy to address.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now I give the floor to Professor Mansouti.
Thank you so much, my colleague, Professor Billot. Mr. Ambassador, first, let me thank you for your talk, your presence, and let me tell also how much it's a pleasure to have you as a neighbor, and how much I enjoy our exchanges. Sometimes we go for lunch, and it's a pleasure to discuss and to listen and to learn from you. So I'm happy, very happy to be able to bring these exchanges to the public fore. Obviously, I'm an anthropologist, I'm not a diplomat, and my perspective is slightly different, but I think quite converging on some aspects. First, I would say, as an anthropologist, I'm extremely interested to understand globally this intervention, what is going on in Afghanistan, and how Afghanistan actually is expressing dynamics and logics which are going beyond the specific case of Afghanistan. And I would like to, in a sense, to react against what, in my private terminology, I call the WWW literature, which means what went wrong. So you have this literature trying to identify mistakes which have been done in Afghanistan, and obviously many mistakes have been done, and probably things could have been different if another decision would have been taken, especially after 9/11 and 2001. But at the same time, I think there are some structural features here at play, and that's what I'm interested in. So how my question would be, what the Afghan situation and the practices and discourses it triggers worldwide is telling us about how today's world is governed. So beyond the mistakes which have been certainly done in Afghanistan and the missed opportunities, and many opportunities have been missed, I'm trying to understand what Afghanistan is telling us about the broader world. And obviously, I don't have clear-cut answers, but I'm trying at least to bring the discussion to the level of structures and not only events. So I would propose two related main arguments today. So the first one is that what is going on in Afghanistan, and I think Ambassador Andisha has mentioned that, is an illustration of the failure of the hegemonic project of peace, liberal peace, and neoliberal peace. In a sense, I think the international community, whatever it may mean, has failed to convince large segments of the Afghan population that their model of society and the state is the best. So many Afghans are not convinced by what was proposed by the international community after the intervention at the end of 2001. So the benefits and value of this model of society is not so much, I think, in the agenda of many Afghans. So that's something I would like to once again, very modestly, I'm not Afghan, but to share with you and as a question. So is it correct? Do you think that's what is going on today is indeed the result of this failure of having convinced large segments of the Afghan population? Because maybe the model of history, the model of the normatized relationship between the state and society was, in a sense, never achieved in the West and was, in some cases, a fantasy we have served to the Afghan population. My second argument, which is directly related, is that this project, this neoliberal peace, was somehow constructed on the triad between the state, the population, and the territory. And this idea that you have a correspondence between the three layers, which once again probably never exists anywhere, but was still inspiring the peace process and the reconstruction of the country. And I would take as an opposed stance mobility as an operator of problematization. So if I look at Afghanistan, what strikes me is how mobile people are. And I'm not only talking about Afghans themselves, but obviously Afghans are extremely mobile. You have refugees who are leaving violence, leaving the country, or IDPs who are moved across the country, within the country. You have diplomats, you have civil servants who are going from place to place to follow some trainings, but you have also all the experts and the military coming to Afghanistan after having been to Timor-Leste, Congo, or Colombia, including people like myself, academics. So you have different ways of being mobile around Afghanistan, which are probably blurring this connection historically proposed between the state, the population, and the territory. So we are in front of something much more mobile and flexible. And I think in order to understand what is going on in Afghanistan, we have to take full acknowledgement of this high level of mobility. Everybody is mobile, not only Afghans, but they are mobile differently. And these different ways of being mobile is probably also a way for us to understand power relations globally. So tell me how you are mobile, and I will tell you who you are on the global ladder of power relations. So that's my two main, I would say, arguments. So now, and I would really insist on something Mr. Ambassador has also concluded with, is the social contract. So, Mr. Ambassador, you were talking about the failure of an institution, let's say the state, but also the society, and the need to reestablish these institutions. But you indeed mentioned that the social contract probably was never totally achieved. And indeed, I wonder sometimes in Afghanistan, the democracy promotion has not taken over this idea of building a social contract. So what does it mean to be an Afghan? What does it mean to live together? On which kind of principles the country and the communion between people is based? So in a sense, I think the technicalities of the democracy promotion took over a more fundamental philosophical, I would say, reflection on what it means to be an Afghan today. And in a sense, war is a very extreme, tragic form of social transformation. And Afghan society has been transformed, partly destroyed by war. But I wonder if we took enough time to understand how the Afghan society has been transformed, and somehow if we could also get some learnings from this transformation in order to build the future, and not only try to wipe out the results of war, but also to learn from these results, and somehow to build on these transformations, which were probably also a response by the Afghan society towards the state in the past. So if you look at the division of the territory before the Taliban, let's say at the end of the 90s, I wonder if the Afghan state could have, in a sense, to a certain sense, learned from how the war has restructured and remapped Afghan society and Afghan territory, in order to also to take some stance in building from the result of war, and not only against the result of war, in a sense. So that's very important for me to understand once again how Afghanistan is a signifier of some more global ways of conceiving the normality of state and society, very often without considering local history, national history. So it's as if you bring one model of society from one place to another, and you overlook how these societies are actually have a very complex and very ancient history. And very often you can hear among expatriates this idea that Afghanistan is a country reluctant to the state. And I strongly disagree, because I think what is today's Afghanistan has an experience of the state which is probably much more ancient than most of Europe today. So once again, we have to fully take granted and to understand the rich history of each place before bringing stereotyped models of the neoliberal peace. So then I would like to bring a few points. So first, indeed, I think the forcing a stereotyped liberal peace without taking fully acknowledgement of how society has been transformed by war was probably a mistake. But I think it's a mistake which could not be avoided. It's a structural mistake. I don't see how it could have been different. But we have held elections at any cost without having first launched a debate about what's the social contract, what makes Afghanistan Afghanistan. And for me, that's very, very important. Second, I think if you look at indicators, okay, Afghanistan is still a country at war. If you look at the Global Peace Index, since it does exist, I think 2009, I'm not totally sure now, but a little bit more than 12 years, 15 years, I don't remember. Afghanistan is the only country in the world which was systematically ranked among the 4 less peaceful countries in the world. Syria now is #1, but came in 2011. You had Somalia, you had South Sudan. Afghanistan was not always the first one in this very, I would say, sad ranking, but was systematically ranked among the 4 or 5 less peaceful countries in the world, and it's still the case. So Afghanistan is still a country at war. And if you look at the costs of war project run by the Watson Institute, it's quite impressive to see the costs of all these post 9/11 wars for the US Treasury. Apparently it's $6.4 trillion US dollars. Trillion, it's 12 zeros. So it's huge. So basically the involvement of the US in places like Afghanistan and Iraq has a very heavy impact on the US Treasury. And in a sense, for the US to withdraw is also, in a sense, a rational economic situation, which rational goes much beyond politics. Then I would like also to situate what is going on in Afghanistan, especially the global circulation of Afghans and non-Afghans, into a global landscape of inequalities. We know that in spite of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, we are probably in the most unequal world in human history. And that's something I believe has to be indeed invited on the scene, because if you meet Afghan asylum seekers in Greece or Italy, they talk about this global inequality. It's not only about wealth, it's also about global inequality in security distribution. So they have a very, I would say, vibrant and explicit acknowledgement of how the world is unequal. The last point, which I believe should be totally considered when we are talking about the future of Afghan society and state, is the demography of Afghanistan. Once again, it's quite impressive to look at all the facts and figures. So the median age in Afghanistan is 19 years. It's one of the youngest in the world. The birth rate is 36, the death rate is 12. So you have a very rapid demographic growth. I think every year Afghanistan should open something like 500,000 new jobs to absorb the youth. That's something which is not possible. 40% of the population is under 14. So it's also a huge challenge in terms of absorbing all these youth coming on the job market. So you have a very important demographics issue. And as long as this demographic issue and the job market is not fitting together, obviously Afghans, even if peace would be brought to the country, will keep moving around and leaving their country. So that's for me very important to take into account all these aspects and to go a little bit beyond just the peace talks per se, because probably the peace talks, they are hiding some more structural, I would say, features explaining how difficult it is to bring peace to Afghanistan. I would probably not speak too much, dear Chair, but for me, to paraphrase the title of the round table, I think we should also indeed, and here I also jump on what Mr. Ambassador said in his conclusion. So we are in dire need of a social contract. And I think no peace talk can be successful if what makes Afghanistan Afghanistan and what makes Afghan citizens is not addressed in the public debate. And to paraphrase the title, I would say it's also from nation building back to nation making. And I believe, as a friend of Afghanistan, as Mr. Ambassador kindly defined me, that Afghanistan is still in need of a nation making process and public discussion. So thank you for now.
Thank you, Professor Mansouti. I wonder if Mr. Ambassador wants to respond to some of the questions you've raised, or whether we should open the floor to questions. I mean, we have already one question in the chat box, but perhaps you want to take a minute, Mr. Ambassador, to respond to Professor Mansouti.
I think Professor Mansouti's questions are very difficult to respond here. Maybe we can sit somewhere and further discuss it. But I will say that it's just important because he has studied Afghanistan. He's done his PhD in Afghanistan, and he looks at the issue from a completely different lens. And that's why it's important to have different lenses when you look into a complex situation like Afghanistan. So I would say that this what he is discussing, and even bringing the issue of mobility. I think this mobility has been also part of who we are in the past 40 years since Soviet invasion. A country where was probably very low in terms of the human mobility. Suddenly they have to first leave the country because of this huge invasion, and then we became probably very few refugees, or maybe even at all. Then suddenly to one of the greatest refugee producing situation, and which is becoming now protracted. So I mean, there are many ways of looking at it. And when you look at this question of mobility, then you can connect the question of mobility, the question of these refugees, to the movement of Taliban. The Taliban movement, basically one of the sources of their creation was the madrasas. and the refugees and the people who have moved across, the Devon line on the other side and stayed there and has been recruited. And then even that mobility right now, in a negative way, is a free mobility of Taliban forces, just, crossing the line, going to the other side, resting and relieving, using all the, hospitals and safe havens. And so that is, you look at it from, and then on the other hand, on the terms of the social upliftment and human development in Afghanistan itself, that mobility also has a very positive impact. You have now millions of Afghans who are living in different countries in the world, which was very few in the past. They are involved in the country. We have a huge number of our diaspora who are now in the country. In fact, there are a lot of them even in the government, leading the government. So basically, there is this sort of interaction with the outside world and the question of mobility, which I really appreciate, and that's why it has to be looked at from the perspective of where Dr. Mansuti comes from. But on the point that we agree, both of us, is this sort of underlying social causes. Again, peace processes or this right moments or open moments of peace building, this time can be used and should be used, and there should be an emphasis, and I'm glad that there is now, as an opening where we have to discuss the underlying causes rather than touching the surface because we have a program or a project or some budget or theories to implement in Afghanistan. I really get annoyed when people say, like, Afghanistan is the longest war of the United States. I mean, we are a country, we're not anybody's longest war. Afghanistan is a country where probably United States or, the other coalitions or countries have fought the longest war, in which, of course, we all have responsibilities. But, to term it as somebody's longest war or somebody's shortest war, I think it gives us probably a very different lens to it. It's a country, 36 million people living and in a very vibrant young society. So I think that will add to that.
Thank you for this answer, Mr. Ambassador. Now I would like to move on to the questions that are piling up in our chat box. And we have only 15 minutes left. So I want to make sure that people receive an answer. And perhaps I start with a question from Emery Connery, who asked, and I quote him, "I'm wondering, should we think of China as a regional actor that could act responsibly and efficiently in favor of the economic and human regional development?" And then following up with that question, there is Kyla Marie Patridge, who asked, what is the role of other regional powers like Russia, China, and India in Afghanistan peace-building process? So I guess this is a question for you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Of course, certainly, when I spoke about Russia here, because it's a summit here, but certainly when it comes to Afghanistan, China is our neighbor. And in any of the peace platform, China is very well involved and has a stake, both security-wise and economically. And so far, China, and to that matter, even Russia, at the level of Security Council, they have never vetoed Afghanistan resolution. They have never, went against an Afghanistan resolution there. So there is a source of, a general level of consensus based on which, the UN and the peacebuilding and peacekeeping, ISAF at the beginning was there in Afghanistan. But certainly the role, I think the new phase is with the withdrawal of NATO forces in a couple of months, a complete withdrawal. Of course, it's the responsibility mostly of the regional countries to create the consensus that I was talking about. But this consensus, this time, will have also a very solid national Afghanistan national element into it. Because we in Afghanistan, and I'm very young, I believe that the intervention of 2001 was partly because of the regional failure. Because if the region could have come together and tried to address the establishment of terror networks in Afghanistan, like Al Qaeda, and the overpowering of Taliban of the government at the time, if the region could have come together, we would not have a reason for, a sort of, extra regional power like United States coming in. So, of course, the region at that time were very busy with themselves. In the 90s, India, Iran, Russia, everybody else was basically, involved, and the world was busy making the post-Cold War liberal order architecture. So that's why everybody forgot about Afghanistan, little Afghanistan there. And now I look at the literature, I see that everybody here built, many resolutions and the rules and institutions in the 90s. It was, the boom of liberal architecture. So that's why Afghanistan was forgotten. So right now, to answer, yes, China has a major role to play. Russia has a major role to play, and certainly India is playing a role. India has, helped a lot of Afghanistan in terms of the development. But then a consensus is needed, because every country here has an interest in peace and security. Afghanistan, this is everyone will say. But what kind of peace, and what will be the stake of Afghans in that peace, and how the interest of Afghans and the interest of the region could come to a balance. And my last point is that the regional institutions, of course, unfortunately, like ASEAN or ECOWAS or other parts of the world, we don't have even AU, African Union. We don't have a regional, strong regional organization which could take charge of this situation. But we have seen, increasingly that the regional organizations are more successful in making peace, in keeping peace, and in building peace.
Thank you for this answer. Another question coming from Miguel Camacho. What is the role of poppy production and opium production and exportation in feeding the armed conflict in Afghanistan?
So I'll leave this to Professor.
Thank you, dear Ambassador. So it could be dangerous. So please, my friend, go first. No, okay. I really talk under ambassadors, authority, but obviously that's the elephant in the room. Now we know that more than 90% of world heroin comes from Afghanistan, and here I want to be very cautious. But we know that most places of production are places where the insurgency is very strong. But if you look at the trading routes, the image is much more blurred, because roughly speaking, it's not so clear, but roughly you have 1/3 of the export through Pakistan, 1/3 to Iran, which is a very important market of consumption. The problem of addiction in Iran is very high. So Iran is absorbing a lot of opium and heroin produced in Afghanistan. And 1/3 is basically towards the north. It's not exactly 1/3, but it's roughly speaking, that's quite equal proportions. So in a sense, the trading routes are not in the hands of the insurgency. So we can imagine, and here I want to be very cautious, because I don't want to make anybody angry, but there is probably some transversal linkages here. You have probably people who might be at war, but might be somehow economically have some partnership. So that's not my field, but that's what, let's say, just mapping productions and trading routes, they are telling you different stories. So there is something like a transversal phenomenon here, which is probably explaining why war is also an economic interest for many people.
Well, you're providing a fabulous transition to the next question, which is a question raised by our friend Antonio Donini, who says, and I quote him, "I agree with the analysis of Mr. Ambassador, especially what he said about the absence of social contract as an obstacle to peace. But isn't the issue of who benefits or profits from war one that needs to be addressed both inside Afghanistan and in the neighboring countries? War is a business for some. Will warlords, drug lords, etc. be brought into the process?"
You see, that's again, we have to, it's as I said, these are cycles. It's just you go to one level and then you have to go down to another one. It's like staircases which are spiraling down. Yes, you are a very good friend, Ambassador. He is touching the points of war as a business there, and then in terms of the social contract, can we bring everybody on board or not? In terms of bringing everyone on board, I believe that yes, the social contract means that it has to be inclusive. And if you look at the 40+ years of Afghanistan, there are very few people who have not been involved in war directly or indirectly. So categorizing it in this way at this stage of peace making will make it very difficult. I think one approach to it is that, look, you have to have, of course, transitional justice built into the peace processes. That's important. But then a social contract has to be inclusive social contract. I mean, one of the criticisms of current social contract that we have, which has come along with the our constitutional lawyer Jirga, was that it's the process and everything left a part of Afghanistan society, even the vanquished Taliban, out of it. The peace processes everywhere work when you bring the victors and the vanquished on the same page and then build from there. I mean, I don't need to give you examples, Germany, Japan, and the other places. So I would not go down to the same route that we went in 2001 or 2 and trying to sort of create these labels, which will slowly become pejorative and by itself become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecies of warlords, this lords and that lords, and now we have many names and many acronyms. So I think it's important to look at it. People, we have it's a country where you have many leaders. Of course, everyone has its own baggages, but the idea of a social contract, the idea of a democratic system is that you have to create an institution in a way that the institution could have a built-in accountability system and model within it at the local level. So if you wanted to make anybody in a society like Afghanistan accountable, you have to make them accountable to its own people. So it's the only people of the communities, like here in the cantons and at the local level, which can make their leaders accountable, and that takes time. Like one of my arguments was that the strongman or the so-called warlords, they're not going to be alive forever. They had a role to play during a war. In one point of the time, they were probably leaders and commanders and freedom fighters. Of course, in the other stage of the war, they turned on to be criminals who kill people. But then they're part of the society. So what you will do with them? Either you sort of ostracize them in a corner, and of course they create their self-defense mechanism, which happened, or you make them responsible and then keep working with them with a hope that a thing could basically move and develop in a stage-wise to all the society, which could accept it. I had this, I can give you this example, and I'll leave it there. When I was working with someone I can't remember who was it in 2003 or 4. So we went to one of these big commanders at the time. And the question was from a journalist who just came in to Afghanistan, didn't have any experience. But she studied, she learned maybe from Wikipedia or something. So I asked this man that, what is your view of the warlords? So this person, to my surprise, asked him that, what do you call George Washington before the independence of the United States? So if you look at the context of a warlord, he was a warlord because he was, raising an army and, resisting an empire and basically, fighting, had his own private armies. And then later on, so they built the states, they became part of the institution, they were the founding fathers of the country. So answer was that, it's important to bring along everyone. And that's why, forget about the warlords. Now we are bringing people who have committed some of the major atrocities, and they are taking the responsibility of bombing supermarkets. They're taking the responsibility of, attacking maternity wards. But why? Because, it's how you start the first stages of peace. So I think when it comes to the social contracts, it's complex, and it has to be inclusive at the, at the inception level, and we should not make the mistakes that we did in the past. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Here is a question from a fellow citizen of Afghanistan. This is Firoz Alizada, who asks, in your views, what are the most predictable mistakes that the current peace process may make or repeat? And are there anything the Afghans should consider to avoid repeating mistakes and missing out this opportunity again? As an Afghan, I'm also concerned with the rising tensions among different ethnicity, and I'm not sure how much is being done by the government to mitigate the deepening of such tensions. Would people-to-people dialogue help?
Will you want to take this, Professor, and then I'll come at the end?
Okay, I think it's certainly also a question on which you have something to say. First of all, let me greet Mr. Firoz Alizada, who is a good friend of mine. So I'm happy to hear your voice through the readings of my colleague Julie. I want to insist really because I want to insist or to jump on what Mr. Ambassador was saying. So a peace process needs to be inclusive. We have to suspend our moral judgment. And a peace process is about sitting with people we don't like and sitting with people we even not only we don't like and we disagree, but we disagree even morally. If not, it's not a peace. If you do peace with people you agree with, it's not a peace process. And that's very painful. And that has to be painful in a sense. And I think that's a mistake which has been done in 2001. You had a defeated side and they were not invited in the peace talks. And we probably, it has been forgotten that they were certainly representing somehow some segments of Afghan population. And if they came back so powerfully, it's because they needed to be included in the peace talks. And I hope, in spite of what is going on now, because we can see the strategy. The strategy, I think, to attack especially Shiites nowadays in Afghanistan is to divide the societies, to create fault lines so deep that they will never be overcome by a peace talk. But I think that's the logic of terror. Terrorists have always tried to create this kind of fault line within societies to prevent people who disagree to sit together. And I think here the resistance and the forward-looking perspective is to, in spite of everything, to sit with people in spite of a disagreement, I would say. So for me, that's very important. And obviously, guilty people have to be brought to court somehow, but peace talks is about sitting and discussing with people with whom, or let's say people among whom disagreement is profound. And the peace talk is indeed as a stake to overcome these disagreements. So we should just keep that in mind because that's the basics. And I think that's what Mr. Ambassador has said, and that's it.
Right, a final question from someone called Ashutosh Patil. How confident are you on the fact that the Taliban will work in cohesion with the elected government in building a democratic future for Afghanistan? So this is perhaps a question to Mr. Ambassador.
I think that's an easy question to answer. That has a yes and no answer. Okay? But I will perhaps be diplomatic here and elaborate. But I wanted also to address parts of the previous question that was raised by a fellow Afghan citizen, and that is the question of the mistakes. Of course, mistakes are what we see from where we stand right now with the help of hindsight. But at least at this stage is our job. Because when we start the peace building process in 2001, I was 20 years old. I don't know how old were you or the other Afghans and colleagues who are listening to this. But now we have a responsibility, because at the time, things were kind of, exported. And again, as I also Professor mentioned, Sandro, that at that time, there was no other approach to peace building. It was the liberal peace building was there, and it was working basically. We had Bosnia, we had of course Kosovo came later on, but then some other contexts, Liberia and the others. So that was the kind of peace building model, and that was to some extent working. But right now, the mistakes that we committed in the past was that the structure of state has to basically meet the requirements of the socio-political realities of today's Afghanistan. Because the structure which was created in the past was fit for the socio-political or even socio-political and economic realities of the time in the 1960s. So what we did, we took the 1964 constitution, just put it there, and then we built around it a few other institutions. And what was even more ironic is that structure, that executive structure, was built for a time where Afghanistan was not democratic. It was going slowly toward democracy. But then with that structure was attached the Bill of Rights, which is amazing in our constitution. And if you look at the rights aspect of it, the rights of the citizen, I think that sort of rights cannot be pursued or fulfilled by the executive structure which exists in the country, because those rights, from freedom of expression through assembly to all these levels of elections which never took place, was built for a completely different executive system, which would have been bottom up. So the upward mobility was not supported in the system, in the structure. That's why everybody, including myself, after you graduate from high school, a little bit of English, you rush to the capital. So you think that this is where it is. And when you rush to the capital, what happened? There is sort of local brain drain. And who fills that position in the provinces? Of course, my family, all of us, we came to come from our village. So it's felt by the others who are less educated or less fortunate or not easily susceptible to the extremists and the others. So one is that we have to look into the question of Afghanistan not only from the prospect of failures of institutions. Institutions will fail. There was a coup d'etat. Let's create the institutions that will work. No, we have to look at it from the, as I said, from social and economic and political underlying causes of the society. I see there's a question about the economy. Yes, the economy has moved us to a different stage where even parts of the local conflict could be still feasible by local resources. So for that, everything is local in Afghanistan. Security and peace building has to be also coming from the local to the top. So that's one thing in the sense of peace building. And the second most important is in our foreign and security policy, where my expertise comes. That in the past 20 years, we paid very little attention to a truly achieving regional security and political consensus in Afghanistan. The aspect of Afghanistan's position in here was completely forgotten. Of course, it's our mistake too. I was young, probably many of us, but then we forgot that NATO cannot extend the security umbrella to Afghanistan. NATO cannot even make Ukraine and Georgia its member, which is at the vicinity of Eurasia. And for thinking to that looking at the geography of a landlocked country, even over flight, you have to come either through Iran or Pakistan. And you think that, the security umbrella coming from across the Atlantic or somewhere else could be sustainable, where the region could create problems. And that's what would happen. Our region at the beginning they complied, they cooperated with the Operation Enduring Freedom, with all this international intervention in Afghanistan, but slowly they start creating problems. And of course, when the region creates problems, you can never achieve peace. So the other way is that this time, we, the Afghans, we have to kind of exhaust all the levels of discussion among ourselves, but together we also create what is called a regional balance within the countries in our neighborhood, because the major element of the conflict in Afghanistan is proxy regional conflict. A proxy regional conflict, one way of hoping to solve it is a neutral Afghanistan.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Unfortunately, we won't be able to take any additional question. I'm told that we need to close this session. So I want to ask everyone to join me in thanking Mr. Ambassador Andisha and Professor Alessandro Monsuti. I also want to mention that this session has been recorded and will be available on the Graduate Institute YouTube channel, so everyone will be able to watch it again. Thank you very much, and see you very soon, I hope, at the Graduate Institute or elsewhere.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much.
Thank you.